Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back if you were with us this morning. So I hope you had a good break, good lunch break, and that you are ready for this riveting afternoon. First, we are pleased to listen to Falko Sniehotta, who is professor at the University of Heidelberg, and who is going to talk about individualized support for weight loss maintenance, the role of physical activity. So, Falko, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation, and I'm really glad I have the opportunity to speak to you today. I would like to achieve three things in the next half hour. I would like to embed the discussion about physical activity and digital interventions a little bit in a public health perspective. I'd like to show you an angle from my own research, which is mainly in the area of obesity and weight loss maintenance. And then I would like to highlight some of the specific opportunities that we have here for personalizing interventions well beyond the level that we regularly see implemented. So as you can see, I'm a professor of public health, social and preventive medicine. So that's perhaps explains some of the background I'm trying to bring into this discussion today. So what a fantastic program. Thank you very much to the SENS team and to Professor Shalabayev for putting it together. What a privilege to see all these fantastic perspectives coming together here. Very much a behavior change psychology audience. And I think it is useful for us to sort of also reflect on the role of these digital interventions in a wider context. For my example of obesity, we know that physical activity is an important part in understanding and potentially treating obesity-related issues, but it's one part of many. And the same will hold true for many of the other contexts, in particular the health context from which we are approaching physical activity interventions. We're interested in preventing heart disease or cancer, or in this case, perhaps type 2 diabetes. And important to understand how different interventions play together in a complex system. So you will have heard these kind of conversations about upstream and downstream interventions. Yeah, we can intervene on physical activity by building bicycle lines in cities. We can intervene on physical activity by building more walkable areas. But we can, of course, also wait until people perhaps have developed substantial risk factors or have already developed disease factors, and we can use that point to intervene. The further down the line we intervene, the more intensive our interventions tend to be, because we are usually looking for quite a big difference. And in this perspective, it's important to note that digital interventions are very much downstream, and they are trying to address those who already have a reason to be concerned about their health. And it's important to memorize that these people are, on the contrary to the majority, usually less educated, less affluent, and have less social capital. And they might also, in many cases, have less digital and health literacy. And these are all issues that the digital intervention world is working against. And in this context, we need to look into the possibilities of these interventions. And one way I always find really helpful for doing this is the re-aim framework by Glasgow and colleagues, where we not only focus on efficacy, which in scientific discussions we often do, but we have already heard wonderful talks earlier today about reach and about who actually do we get to take part in these interventions. What do we need to offer? What do we need to do for people to engage? Do they engage because of the health benefits that the intervention might promise? Or might they engage because of gaming? What is the amount of efficacy that we can get out of such interventions, and how does it relate to, for example, health literacy? Is somebody with the same, with a higher level of education more likely to benefit from the intervention because it requires regularity, it requires reading, it requires comprehension? Or can the interventions also pick up people who perhaps haven't got the same level of background knowledge and literacy? Really important to understand how we can get people engaged and how we keep them engaged in the interventions. But there are also some areas where we really have an advantage, like in terms of implementation, we have a much bigger control in digital interventions over the fidelity of the interventions. So the degree to which the intervention is delivered as planned than we have in many other face-to-face settings. And the other point that remains important for me and has also come out of the talks earlier today is the question of maintenance. The typical pattern of many apps in general, for example, but health apps even more so, is that people download them, they use them briefly, and then they discard them. And they discard them probably because it's part of the lifestyle that we use with apps, but they might also discard it early on because they realize it doesn't meet their needs. It isn't specifically tailored to what they want to get out of it. And that is one of the foci I would like to bring in this conversation today. And I do this from an area of individual weight loss. And it seems slightly contrasensical after I just sort of talked about the importance of upstream interventions. But I'll briefly make the case as a background. So the idea of individual weight loss, should a public health professor even be engaged in that kind of activity? The answer, as you will imagine, is yes. Yeah, I would argue that personal weight loss has a worse reputation than the evidence suggests it ought to have. So we tend to get these kind of messages. We hear about diets not working, we hear about yo-yo diets, and people essentially neither find it acceptable for people to be obese, nor do they see any feasible way of getting out of it, which adds to the difficult experiences that people who live with obesity have. Consequently, we want to break this down a little bit, and we highlighted whether healthcare professionals recommended or not losing weight and becoming more physically active are the main intentions that people have in most countries where I've done research. So this are an example for the New Year's resolutions that people in the United Kingdom have made in the year 2019. And you can see our topic today couldn't be more central to what people think about when they are getting into the new year. They want to be fitter. They want to lose weight. They want to improve their diet. Other things like hobbies and money come well after those points. So it seems to be the one thing that keeps us together. And indeed, we have conducted a systematic review of prevalence studies all over the world over decades. And we have found out that a substantial amount of adults with and without overweight is trying to lose weight every year. We have estimated that in the European Union, at least 250 million people will make a weight loss attempt every year. And these are, of course, quite substantial numbers, and they go beyond what we normally do in psychology when we ask people to name their intentions. Here we go well beyond the intention. We see engagement, and more than that, we see people investing a lot of their personal time, but even more so money, to try to control their body weight. So we are dealing here with a very willing audience. More so, there's evidence that weight loss in principle is possible, regardless of the discussions around it. So this is a very pragmatic trial, the famous Lighten Up trial in England, that essentially tests how effective those weight loss services are that you can find at the high street. And I'm not quite sure which of those are available in France, but I'm pretty sure that Weight Watchers, or WW as they're now called, will be available in France. And you can sort of see, compared to an exercise-only comparator, compared to deliveries through general practice, compared to pharmacy, these are effective interventions. Yeah, what you can see here is a bit specialist data. You have BOCF, which is baseline observation carried forward. You have complete cases only, and you have last observation carried forward. These are merely statistical handles of the fact that in weight loss studies, people who are not successful tend to drop out. And we need to make some assumptions about what happens to them when they drop out. But on the whole, we see these are not dramatic weight loss successes, but they are clinically worth having, they're affordable, and they're widely available. So people, in principle, can lose weight, and as we have seen, they do lose weight. But as you have already seen in my initial slide showing that the idea of weight loss as such is controversial, there are issues with weight gain. There's the elephant in the room, that is weight regain. In the English literature, we sometimes hear the term yo-yo diet. And a yo-yo is a sort of really misleading example for what happens when you diet, because in the yo-yo, the physical forces that you impose on the yo-yo on its descent determines the rate of its ascent. And that clearly isn't the case in obesity at all. What we do know is that most weight loss attempts peak within about 6 months. What you also see here is that physical activity alone is not a very sensible weight loss treatment. There's a very poor evidence to it. Physical activity with diet works okay, but frankly, for losing weight, diet only tends to slightly outperform diet plus physical activity. And the role of physical activity really, to my mind, cutting along literature quite short for you, is in weight loss maintenance. After the initial weight loss is achieved, that is the point when people would want to increase their physical activity. And that is also the focus that I will take here now. So both in randomized controlled trials, as you can see on this slide, you have weight loss, and that's usually followed by weight loss maintenance, or in other words, by weight regain. If we only look at people who complete their programs in all available interventions, we see people will regain. So even if they are adherent to the intervention, there is a level of regain that is physically involved in the intervention. So can we keep it off? And how can we keep it off? And what is the role of physical activity? And indeed, what is the role of potential digital interventions to support it? So when we look into the largest prospective longitudinal study, the US National Weight Control Registry, you see that they have followed up 10,000 adults who lost weight of at least 30 pounds, so quite substantial weight loss, maintained it for a year or more, so quite substantial level of maintenance, and they have been followed up for 10 years. So in some ways, the most impressive longitudinal cohort, albeit perhaps not representative of any other population that there is, except for these really quite outstanding weight loss individuals. And what you can see here is the predictors at baseline of long-term maintenance are related to regularity of intake, but also in particular to quite substantial levels of physical activity. And that adds to literature from trials showing that physical activity in weight loss maintenance seems to be a highly beneficial strategy. So we wanted to understand how this works in trials, and we did the first large systematic review of randomized controlled trials where people get randomized after they've lost weight. So they first lose weight, then they have randomization, and then we check whether behavioral, and in this study also pharmacological interventions, but I can summarize those findings in one sentence for you, and we don't have to go there, whether they help to reduce the rate of weight regain after initial weight loss. The brief answer for the pharmacological interventions is that yes, they work. They don't work significantly better than the behavioral ones, and they tend to have a sort of maximum range of prescription. Therefore, we can save here, we can focus here on the behavioral ones without losing much content. And what you get here, and that's a bit complicated, and I just sort of focus you on that little red number underneath the forest plot. We get a possibility of these interventions to reduce weight regain at the rate of about 1.5 kilograms a year. Now, is that absolutely amazing? Well, probably it isn't, but it's clinically relevant. If it could be scaled up, it would be highly beneficial for population health. And as you can see from the plot as well, there's a huge level of variability between the interventions. And here for the first time, theory comes in, because we noted that substantial heterogeneity and we wanted to break it down. And apologize for the small fonts. I explain what it means. So in the bottom, you have a set of trials that have used absolutely no theory. And in those trials, they haven't found any difference between the trial arms, the intervention arms, and the control arms. So there's no effect, quite straightforward. Then there is a sort of set of trials that used sorts of self-regulation theory approaches, and they do much better. And they are high-quality trials with very low risk of bias. And then there is a third set of trials. About two things need to be said. Firstly, they used all the same theory, which is a problem-solving approach, which I will show you in a moment. But also they're all authored by the first author, Perry, and they all have a reasonably high risk of bias. And so we're not quite sure how reliable this information is. So depending on how you want to look at it, you can have 3 reliable groups here, or you could focus on the first 2 groups where we have quite a solid difference between intervention use versus no intervention use. So that brings us to the question of theory, really. We were absolutely eager to understand what we are doing in maintenance and wanted to understand what is the theoretical base for our doing and our interventions. And so I give you here the 6 perhaps most famous theories. So Martin Hager, you made it into the top 6 with the integrated behavior change model. We have the HAPA, the theory of planned behavior, social cognitive theory, protection motivation theory, and the COMBI. I'm not sure you can read all the words here, and I don't think that is so important. But what is important for the purpose of this talk is to highlight is that all these theories have a lot of commonalities. They highlight the importance of social cognitions. They highlight the importance of self-efficacy, intention, and planning. And they don't say a huge amount about 2 things that we're quite passionate about. One is context and environment. And the other one is perhaps features of the audience for which this particularly applies. The third thing, that's really important for me, and it's really something I am rather interested in, is none of those theories, in line with most of psychology, mentions time in anything. Time is not an issue. So Professor Aina Shalabayev has led this beautiful commentary piece, which is an open science framework and currently under submission. So we are really interested in the role of both focus on the context and the environment in which action happens, and as well on the audiences. And I'd like to sort of go into some detail on that, if you allow. So at the heart of social cognitive theory by Bandura, you have this idea of a reciprocal determinism. And what it really means is that the behavior at any given time is a function of the relevant cognitive and situational factors at the time before that. And vice versa, you can break in a reciprocal relationship, you can break down all the other factors like this as well. So anything is, any such factor here is described as a function of the other factors at previous time points. So time is a really important point. So that your behavior now affects your intention in the future, and your intention now will affect your behavior in the future. And there's a perpetual relationship between these factors over time. That's very much what social cognition models, I think, assume. That's how it works. And the question is that quite enough to understand how people, once they have taken up a behavior, once they have performed it a number of times, that they will maintain it over a very, very long time, and perhaps at some stage develop new habits. Ellen Rodring from the Netherlands, in the team of Martje van Stralen, did this beautiful systematic review of predictors of lapse and relapse in prospective studies. And for now, let's focus on the upper half of those results, on physical activity. What we find is that the main predictors are indeed the kind of predictors that would have been found in each of the social cognition models that I've shown you. A lack of self-efficacy, self-regulation, behavior control will predict relapse. A lack of self-efficacy will also predict lapses. And the more cons, the more negative outcome expectancies people hold, the more likely they are to relapse. That seems to make a lot of sense and speak in the direction of those models. So I promised you I'll give you a brief breakdown of the 5-step problem-solving model that we have found to be so much related to effectiveness in those trials. And I think if you can see that it's probably what most psychologists would do anyway in almost everything. And we didn't find anything particularly unique that would explain this very high level of efficacy that we have found in those trials. So to me, Is this coherent with the type of interventions that we have seen being described as self-regulation interventions? And there's a whole book to it that, again, doesn't give us anything discrete from the other models. So there might be a little bit of an issue with the risk of bias, but it is probably a similar idea that if people essentially set goals, focus on their decision-making, focus on the behaviors, and have some test exit procedures, that's probably a good thing to do when you're trying to orchestrate different behaviors that all work together in trying to affect an outcome, which is here weight. So the complexity, of course, is much higher than the complexity the behavioral models are mostly built for. And then there are specific theories of maintenance. So here's one that we have published in Health Psychology Review in 2018 by Caldwell and colleagues. And it focuses on aspects like executive function and the idea that that executive function specific to the maintenance of a behavior may develop over time and may explain those health behaviors. It does bring in aspects of identity, which many empirical, both qualitative and quantitative studies have found to be relevant in social cognitions, in maintenance, I apologize, in maintenance. But noteworthy here that all the social cognitions are either gone or put here as indicators of identity, which seems a peculiar way of theorizing about maintenance. In the same journal, different authors show here what's often the case. We're not really trying to regulate a behavior or a set of behaviors. We're often trying to orchestrate something else. Ultimately, in this case, it's weight, but for the authors here, it's a tension to relapse to old behaviors. And I think that sort of tension is an interesting factor because it opens up for individual factors that can feed into the tension. And that suggests that not everybody will respond to the same model. And of course, in theory-based working, that starts becoming a little bit of a problem. So we have sort of looked into the idea of two alternative programs of behavior, the old behavior and the new behavior, and the potential for each of those behaviors to become dominant. And in this period A that is shown here, that's what we often find in people who've just lost weight. They feel very much in control. They don't want to be the subject of an intervention, and they're quite happy without a huge amount of support. But then in the period B, they experience a lapse. And from our research, in qualitative research, ecologic momentary assessment, other observations, we often find that the switch from one to the other is very rapid. Somebody who today says they're fully in control might tomorrow find themselves in a lapse. So really helpful would be if we could identify some of those areas when people are in need of more intensive interventions and intervene accordingly. And the idea also is that over time, people might have different phases in which more and less interventions and perhaps different types of interventions are needed. And again, if we can pick up those needs through digital technology, and if we can feed into those needs, that would certainly make the interventions more acceptable for people. They're more likely to continue using them because they wouldn't be bothered with what they perceive to be unmatching intervention content, and it might also bring up the efficacy. So I realize I'm talking slower than I did, so I briefly jump over this and say we had a wonderful PhD student who many of you know, Dominika Kwasniewska, who has been through more than 100 behavioral theories to try to extract from those theories what are the kind of themes of maintenance. And what she has found is that there are 5 areas that really seem to matter. One is to have maintenance motives, which are often very different from the original motives that people had when they started the behavior change. In particular, related to satisfaction with the outcomes, a congruence with one's identity, beliefs or values, or the idea that one realizes continuous reinforcement, probably because one thinks one is doing well. And that as such is a serious matter of reinforcement. The second theme, in line with those trials that I've shown you, is self-regulation. Set goals, monitor progress, reduce discrepancies, plan, monitor, and so on. Clearly, they have a strong grounding in theory. The idea of personal resources comes out of the observation, for example, that when people make lapses or have relapses, they often feel a bit stressed. They sometimes are under the influence of alcohol. They're very tired. When personal resources are down, overwriting old habits in favor of healthier activities is difficult, and it impedes the project of maintenance. Recent years have shown an increase in the science of automaticity in behavior, in particular around habits and routines. And that is a fourth theme that she has identified. And finally, and really important, and perhaps most ignored by many of our behavioral psychological theories, is that the environment and the social influences play an important role in maintenance. One can change in an environment that isn't supportive, but because this environment that isn't supportive continuously provides cues to relapse, the chances to sustain the behavior over time is diminished. So based on this, we essentially have the idea that people aren't just managing a behavior and within, or even a program of behavior in which physical activity plays a role, but they are managing essentially the relationship between two learned programs, a newly adopted behavior and an old behavior. The old behavior, because it's sometimes been performed in its program for decades, it's very powerful, will always be there, and has to be managed against the factors influencing the new behavior. And when we do this, here's an example of observational N of 1 studies. These are quantitative studies where people every day answer a few questions by phone related to the theory. We measure their physical activity, we measure their weighing behavior, and we then essentially get this kind of data. Here's the data of one person over 180 days, where they every day weigh themselves and every day report their adherence to their weight loss maintenance plan. And we can then start modeling these things for different individuals. So now please bear with me. This looks like a terrible slide, and it is. But what you can see here is in the RAWs, you have 8 participants. I didn't fit all 12 on it. I just want to make a point here, really. And then there are predictors, essentially maintenance motives, self-regulation, habit, personal resources, and environment that people answer every day through ecologic momentary assessment. And then we essentially analyze the data. And what I want to show here is not all the details. What I want to show here is how much there is to learn from it. So take importance within maintenance motives, for example. We have the whole range over more than half a year. In participant 8, it's a very powerful predictor that gives us a good prediction of their behavior, whereas in participant 5, it isn't even significant. If we take self-regulation, again, we see here within the same factors, the range from take obstacles, perceived obstacles. For participant 3, it predicts almost all of their behavior. For participant 4, it doesn't at all. And there are other examples. And finally, also across people. Some people are very predictable and others aren't. And all of these factors allow, in principle, such a good prediction of people over time, including trends, including moving averages, including circularities of annual, monthly, weekly patterns that allow interventions to become increasingly sophisticated in targeting the key moments. So now very briefly for the end, an example how we tried to implement this. This is the NULevel trial that's been published in PLoS Medicine. And what we really tried to do is we tried to target as much as we can with this population. And we also wanted to make sure we don't just get our educated cashmere jumper wearing previous teachers, but we wanted to have the whole population. So we went into some of the poorest neighborhoods in England to recruit. We had also help from weight loss providers, from the NHS, from a range of sources to have a diverse audience. And here the idea was really that everybody gets a scale at home, and this scale helps us to understand both what they're weighing, but also almost as important for this research, whether they're weighing themselves or not. And that allowed us then to compare both arms against each other. The control arm didn't get any particular instructions how often to weigh themselves. In the intervention arm, we asked people to weigh themselves on a daily basis. Yeah, that's very much what I said. The combination between the digital technology, the self-reported data, and the intervention was kicked off with a single face-to-face session. And the content itself wasn't particularly unique. Essentially, people set goals that we monitored their steps, we monitored their self-reported behaviors, like eating behaviors, and critically, we monitored their weighing and weight. And based on that, we tailored the intervention to the people. That meant in phases where they seemed fully in control, the intervention was very, very light indeed. In periods in which they became increasingly struggling with their weight loss maintenance, the intervention was scaled up. And essentially, what we found here is that the intervention did not make a difference to weight loss maintenance. To our dismay, although we had fantastic retention, almost everybody completed the trial. But what we did see a significant effect on physical activity, which will have been related to the monitoring of their walking behavior. So the more specific behavior, the more concrete behavior, we did get an effect, whereas for weight loss maintenance, we didn't get one, which was partially explained to the fact that the control group did better than we thought, and so there might have been the monitoring effect of the scale overriding some of the effectiveness. So if we look into self-weighing, one of the factors, we, for example, saw that some of our theories did seem to work. So people in the intervention arm weighed themselves more often than people in the control arm. And those who weighed themselves every day didn't put on any weight. But the key point here is that in terms of weight, it didn't work. In terms of the secondary outcome of physical activity, it did work. So reflections towards the end, if you allow. So I think for weight and for other maintenance, social cognitions are important, but of course, to some degree, they are already, the variability is reduced. Those people in our examples who have already lost weight, well, yes, clearly they will have positive intentions. They will have some level of self-efficacy through their success. They will have positive outcome expectancies. So you don't see the full variability that you see in people who haven't acted yet. And that, of course, diminishes the predictive utility. Yeah. But also we find that context, time, the fact that people have multiple behaviors to manage at the same time, and characteristics of the audience aren't really covered in social cognition models. That's why we are working with colleagues on extensions of those models and trying to make them more suitable for that quite specific and different context of maintenance that we are looking into. We also find that people seem to be so tremendously different in how they maintain and what determines and predicts their maintenance behavior that it seems very difficult to see a single model being applied. Rather, what we are doing is we are looking into factors from different models and trying through empirical means to build an individualized context around the individual, which we can then use to tailor interventions. And that gets us into this kind of world of just-in-time adaptive interventions that have the potential to optimize reach, retention, and effectiveness for interventions. And that is very much a flexible and perhaps unconventional use of behavioral models, but that's where we are at this stage. And I would be absolutely delighted to hear your feedback on this. Thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Falko, any question in the audience?
Hello, Falko, it's Aina. In the last study you presented, so if I understood correctly, there was an effect of the intervention on physical activity, but not on weight maintenance. So
That is correct, yeah.
Does this suggest that it was more easy, or it is more easy to change physical activity or to maintain a change in physical activity than in a diet?
Well, we have more. I hear myself very loudly. I probably have to switch it off a bit. We have more evidence and more research experience in changing physical activities than we have in affecting weight loss maintenance. So that is certainly true. And of course, in terms of the physical activity measurement, we have quite fine and real-time measures, whereas the weighing and the weight is a slow-moving variable. It's slightly more difficult to intervene on it. So in some ways, that might have explained why, in that particular context, it was a bit easier to change physical activities than weight.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I was wondering, how can you explain that some people are more predictable than others? Where does this come from? Is it coming from the environment or something else? I'm just curious about this.
That's such a wonderful question. Two issues about that. So first of all, there's a methodological flaw in the method that we're using, which is if you have no variability at all in your behavior, then the variability cannot also not be predicted. So the idea of intra-individual variability requires a level of variability. Now, we have tested this in our participants, and they usually have sufficient variability to analyze them. So it's not just a methodological flaw. But for example, one thing that has been theorized is that people who live in uncertain economic circumstances are less predictable because, for example, it's more difficult for them to plan ahead because they have less control over the circumstances of their life. So that would be, for example, one factor that has been identified as a predictor of the intra-individual predictability. If people have a lot of different struggles that they need to attend to simultaneously, they might not be able to put physical activity as much as a priority than other people, who then might become more predictable. Other people might be more predictable on through factors that we haven't measured. It's also really important, whilst we are trying to reflect on some environmental factors too. These are, in our study, reported environmental factors. So we don't know what the actual environmental factors were and to what degree they had controlled the variability. So there's a lot we do not know. What we can say at this stage is that there are huge differences in terms of the, we use a variation of regression methods with autocorrelation, and you can really interpret this a bit as a determination coefficient, and the differences are just absolutely substantial.
Other question? Yeah, Clément.
Yeah, Falko, we have one online question from Alia Amirova. So first, I thank you for your presentation. And the question is, could you please expand how would you scale up the intervention at the critical time point when relapse is likely to happen? What does it entail?
Yeah, I suppose in the future, you would use some artificial intelligence to do that. In our case, we essentially define scenarios. So for example, when people weigh themselves less regularly, it's usually a risk factor. So we start asking more questions. And then essentially in this study, there were algorithms trying to test different scenarios that we had hypothesized. I think, to be honest, in the future, you just use a good artificial intelligence algorithm that tries to link factors and tries to sort of predict lapses. But that can be done both intra-individually as well as inter-individually. But that's of course the art. The other point is some of the questions were simply self-reflective. So we asked people how tempted they are, how confident they are, how high their self-efficacy is. And it's quite clear from what we have shown that if people say, my confidence is going down and my temptation is going up, and there's a very clear pattern, I think. We also asked them to indicate if special events happen, which they are worried about that. There was also a level of text message exchange possible. So we did a few things. We tried to pick up a few low-hanging fruit, but compared to what is technically possible, those algorithms were quite primitive, I would say, and quite early stage. And I think, especially with large samples and many observations, with good artificial intelligence, you should be able to do it much better.